So today's daf in Masechet Zevachim, we're moving up, is daf Tzadi 90. And yesterday was a long daf. This is actually a parak of 2.5 days. This parak, 3.5 days, right? Yeah, almost 3 days, three plus. We're not going to finish it tomorrow. Anyways, I've called it Tadir Kodem, but it's a good review because it goes through all the carbonot, so you remember everything you ever learned. And so yesterday, I believe he got up to Amar Ravina, if I'm correct, which is around 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Peitat Amabet.
That is correct.
Okay, so let's do that because it's a new Gemara and it's a very interesting Gemara. If you recall, we've had this issue come up before, and it's confusing every time. But basically, one of the halachot that's really important is that a karban that's yotzei, a karban that's supposed to be in the azara, that leaves the azara, becomes pasul, right? And when you shecht an animal, the animal is supposed to be sacrificed. Well, depending on what animal, but a kachim kalim, the emurim are supposed to be put on the mizbeach. The basar is supposed to be eaten by whoever, depending on the case, right? Now that basar can leave the Beit HaMikdash because it's can be eaten in the whole Yerushalayim, but the emurim are not supposed to leave. The question comes up: what if the emurim, which are supposed to stay in the Beit HaMikdash, leave, but they leave before the zrikat hadam? So you shechted the animal, the blood is in a cup, you haven't sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach yet. So the reason that that matters is that if you recall, by kachim kalim, they're not chayvim me'ilah until after the zrika, right? Because if you dedicate an animal to the Beit HaMikdash, you then use it, you're not chayvim me'ilah until after you do zrika. So you're in this in-between time where you shechted it, but you didn't finish the job yet. So it says, we'll see why this is relevant, of course, in a minute. It says Ravina Bar Shila, 8 lines from the 10 lines from the bottom. I'm Ravina Bar Shila. Emurei kachim kalim sheyatzu lefnei zrikat damim. If you take the limbs of a carbon kachim kalim, say shlamim, that is taken outside of the azara before you did zrika of the blood of the animal, psulim, they became pasul, meaning even though you haven't yet sort of made the carbon finalized by doing the zrika, it's pasul because you took it out and you can never eat them again, you can never use them, you can't put them on the mizbeach, they're pasul. Says Ravina Bashila Tanatuna. In fact, it's supported from our Mishnah because our Mishnah said yesterday that when you have birds and you have animals, that the animals go first. Mipnei, now according to the Mishnah, Mipnei shehu zevach, because the animal is a quote unquote sacrifice. V'yeshnu kadshe kadashim, and it has holy things that are put on the mizbeach, and that is damav ve'emurim, the blood and the parts. Now, Bishlama emurim, I get the parts, right? Let's nubaofot. There's certainly some birds that you don't put the parts of the bird on the mizbeach, like an olat, like a chatata oaf, where you don't burn any of it on the mizbeach. You eat the whole thing. But so I get that an animal is stricter when it comes to parts of it. Every animal is put on the mizbeach, and not every bird is. But eladam miyaita. What do you mean that an animal is more strict because you put blood on the mizbeach? Every bird has blood put on the mizbeach also, right? So what's stricter? Ella must be lav kamash malan. It must be that the Mishnah is teaching you a murim ki damo, that the limbs of an animal that are put on the mizbeach are treated like the blood. Ma damo ifnei zrika, just like the dam of an animal that left the azara before zrika. You shechted an animal, you took the blood, you put it in a cup, and then you walked outside. That becomes pasul even though it's before zrika. Now the reason you know that is because if it was after zrika, you'd already did the zrika. There's no problem taking out the blood. So the only problem with taking out the blood is before zrika. So af emurim kodem zrika. So too, taking out emurim before zrika is a problem. V'kakari lahu kachei kadashim, right? And it's calling it something holy and telling you ma damo mifsal biyotzei af imurav mifsal biyotzei. So just like the blood would become pasul if you took it out of the Beit HaMikdash before zrika, so too the basar would become pasul if you took it outside. So our Mishnah is teaching you this halacha of Ravina Bar Shila. Says the Gemara now at the last words on these on the fifth to last line. Nema Misayeli. Let's prove this from another statement of two Amoraim, and this is a statement of Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. It says the Gemara, 4 lines on the bottom. Let's say you have basar kachim kalim. Now remember, this is basar. So get the distinctions. We were just talking about emurim before, which are the part that go on the mizbeach. The basar of the kachim kalim. Now this is a little bit different because ultimately, excuse me, after you shech the animal, you're going to eat the basar, right? That's what you're supposed to do, have a big meal. So, but you haven't yet done zrika, right? So basar kachim kalim, you have basar of a shlamim, let's say, sheyatsa lifnei zrikat damim, and you took it outside of the Beit HaMikdash before you did zrika. So Rabbi Yochanan says, kasher, no problem. eat that. Now you can't eat it now, but you can eat it after you do zrika. And Rish Lakish Amar pasul. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kasher, because hol v'sofa latzeit, since it's going to go out anyways, right? Once you do zrika of the animal, you take the meat and take it home with you if you're living in Yerushalayim and you eat it. So the fact that you took it out, took it home a little earlier, is not a problem. You just took it out early. Rish Lakish says it's pasul because I got a dayin lo yiyaz mano latzeit. Says Rish Lakish, well, no, but it's true that you're going to take it home eventually, but only after Zrika. Since you took it out too early, you jumped the gun and it's pasul. Now that's a statement of Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Says the Gemara, or Ravina Bar Shila, Ad kan lo pligi el bebasar. Now they only are arguing about the meat. Avo be'emurim lo. But it seems like they don't argue about the emurim, and that by the emurim, everybody agrees that if you take it out, it would be pasul. Why does everyone agree that? Because Rabbi Yochanan's rationale was, you can take out the basar because you're going to take it out eventually anyways. But the emurim, you're not going to take out eventually anyways. What are you supposed to do with the emurim? Burn them on the mizbeach. They're never supposed to go out. So it seems here that everybody agrees that it's pasul, which is what Rabbi Bar Shila said. Ravina Bar Shila, sorry. Says Gemara, not necessarily. Look, who adin the emurim nami pligi? It could be the Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish argue even about the limbs of the animal that are burned on the mizbeach. V'hab de kamiflagi b'basar. The reason they argue about the meat is lo diach lekochet Rish Lakish. Tell you that Rish Lakish says it's pasul even though it's meat that you're eventually going to take out. The afilo basar desofa latzeit adayin lo giyaz mano latzeit. Right. So Tosfos I think points out, yeah, Rashi maybe someone points out that you'd obviously have to say that when Rabbi Yochanan said, right, that it is kosher hol v'sofa latzeit, he didn't literally mean that, because if he was implying not just the meat but even the emurim, maybe those words were added or something. I forget who says that. Someone says that. Anyways, continues the Gemara now. Yeah, Rashi says it actually. Sorry, I'm quoting Rashi. Continues the Gemara now. That is, where am I? Ask the Gemara, why did you say Lema Kitanai? Sorry. Let us say there's a machloket Tanaim about how you treat something that is the emurim, the parts that's supposed to go on the mizbeach of kachim kalim that are sent outside or taken outside the azara before zrikat damim. Because listen to the following braita. Says the braita, emurei kachim kalim shiatzu lifnei zrikat damim. This sounds like it's exactly our question, right? The parts of a kachim kalim that were taken out of the azara before zrika. Says the Braita in Me'ilah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer ein ma'alim bahem. There's no chiyuv of Me'ilah on those parts. Remember, I told you, and this is really important, that by kachim kalim, you're only chayiv in Me'ilah after the zrika. So presumably, you took this part out, you then did the zrikat adam. Says Rabbi Eliezer, it doesn't matter. The fact that you took it out too early means that you ruined the whole thing, right? And ein chayavim aleim mishum pigol notar v'tamei. And you're not chayiv for them for pigol notar v'tamei. Remember that in order for something to have pigol, it has to be done properly, right? The whole thing has to be done properly. This wasn't done properly. Notar, the same thing. It has to be something that's potentially edible, and these things are not edible. And Rashi says tamei too. It has to be something that, of course, you can't eat it if it's tamei, but the isser of eating kachim b'tumah only applies to kachim that are basically kosher, okay? Rabbi Elikiva Omer, the opposite. I disagree about everything. Ma'alim bahem, that you're chayiv mi'ilah in them, and chayivin aleim mishum pigol notar v'tamei. Now, so clearly, you took these parts out before the zrika. Rabbi Eliezer says they're pasul. Rabbi Akiva says they're not pasul. Now, what's the case, right? Did you bring them? Where were they when you did zrika? My lav, says the Gemara, we're assuming in this braita in mi'ilah, third line, sorry, the bahadar ailinu pligi. Machloket is where you took the part out of the Beit HaMikdash. Someone called you up and said, wait a second, why are you taking it out? They haven't done it yet. You brought it back inside. Then you did Zrikat Tadam, right? So at the time that you did Zrikat Tadam, they were inside the Beit HaMikdash. The question is, did taking them out ruin them or not? And that's the argument. B'hapligi. Marsavar mifsala biyotzi and marsavar lo mifsala biyotzi. The machloket is whether taking it outside before Zrika, if you then bring it back inside and then do Zrika, is that zrika effective for this thing? According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's not. So there's no mi'ilah, there's no pigol, there's no notar. And according to Rabbi Akiva, it is. So there is all of those things. It says we're not necessarily. Amar of Papa, it could be that that's not the case. That bidahadr ailinu kuliamu lo pligi. That in fact, if you brought them back into the Beit HaMikdash, everybody would agree that they're okay, that they're kosher. Unlike what Ravina Bar Shila said, right? Well, I keep saying Rabba, but Ravina Bar Shila. That they would actually be okay if you brought them back in. The machloket here is where you didn't bring them back in. So they're sitting outside the Beit HaMikdash. Hacha b'di'itnu avrei pligi, where they are sitting, itnu means they are present, avrei, outside, is where there's a machloket. And the machloket here is totally separate. It's whether the zrika that's done is able to apply to parts of the animal that are not in the Beit HaMikdash. And that's a whole different machloket. B'hapligi, mar savar ein zrika mo'el t'liyotzei. Rabbi Eliezer holds that zrika is not effective for something outside the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore you basically didn't do zrika for it. So there's no me'ilah, there's no pigol, there's no notar. And Mar Savar, Rabbi Kiva holds zrika mo'el liyotze, right? So that is potentially what they're arguing about, not showing that there's clearly a machloket tanaim that someone says it's possible. So this interpretation is that everybody might agree that it's kosher. That if you take it outside before zrika, that doesn't passel it as long as you bring it back inside, right? Says Gemara, but why would they have to argue about that again if not why did they argue again, but Rav Papa said that there was another case where Rav Papa hu da'amar b'di'itnu avroi kol yama lo pliki, right? Rabbi Papa said in a different case in Sechem Me'ilah, which we're going to explain in 1 second, that in fact, if the thing is outside, I'll give it away. The other case is the shtei halechem of atzeret, right? So remember in atzeret, we talked about this yesterday. To those who were in Daf yesterday, Nava, you would bring 2 loaves of bread with the kivsei atzeret. Let's say you shechted the kivsei atzeret and you took the bread outside before doing the zrika, right? And then you did the zrika, but the bread was not inside the azar when you did the zrika. So does the zrika affect that? Does it work for that bread or not work for that bread? So there, Rav Papa said, that if the bread is outside, that it doesn't help. The machloket Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, which is the same argument, is if you brought the bread back inside. So how could Rav Papa say in one case that the machloket is when you brought it back inside, and the other case he said the machloket is when it's only outside, right? Says the Gemara, because they're very different cases. Hani mili, where Rav Papa said the second case, Hani mili gabi shtei alechem. It's talking about the bread, because the bread lav gufa de zivchahu. The bread is completely secondary. It's not the main part of the animal. It's an accompaniment, right? Something that goes along with it. But when you're talking in this case about the limbs of an animal, aval emurim, the gufa, the zivchahu, then in this case, even if they're outside, they argue. Meaning, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rav Papa, agree that if you leave the bread outside and you do zrika of the blood, it doesn't affect the bread because the bread is like a secondary thing, and it has to be inside for it to work. But when you're talking about the parts of the animal, it's possible. It's a machloket that even if you take the parts of the animal and you put them outside the Beit HaMikdash in the Azara, let's say, not in the Azara, in the Ezrat Nashim, right? And they're outside at the time you do zrika, there is an opinion, Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that zrika counts for those parts. Okay, so basically from this you can't prove that there's a Tana who holds, or that all Tanaim hold, that if you take the animal out, that it's possible. Okay, now we're up to the 2 dots, around 12 lines down from Daf Tzadi Amid Aleph, and we're back to our Mishnah. So if you recall, our Mishnah said that birds come before flour, ofot kadmim leminachot, because ofot are blood. That's what you said? Good. Ofot kadmim leminachot, says Mar but adrabah. Minchot kadamot, why don't you say that minachot are more important? Shekain yeshnam b'tzibur ki b'yachid. And this is a very interesting point, which many have not thought about, which is that a mincha can be brought by a tzibur, like a mincha to omer, right? Or shtei halechem, the mincha we just gave, or mincha to tzibur. If you think about it, there is never, ever a bird that is brought for a tzibur.
Okay. No
karban tzibur is a bird, ever. It's only brought by individuals. So maybe it should be more important to have a mincha because it's a public thing. Says Gemara, but still, it's blood. Still, blood trumps all. So blood trumps flour. So, just making too much noise. Okay. Okay, the next thing we said in the Mishnah is that a minchat chotei, a mincha that's brought for a sin, is precedent to a mincha of nidava, because a minchat chotei is brought for a kapara, and a minchat nidava is just a gift, so it's not as important. Okay, says the Gemara, but why don't you say adarabba minchat nidava kodemet? Say that a minchat nidava should come first. Shekain tu'una shemen ulevona. Right? If you recall, a regular mincha, you have to bring oil and spices on it, but a minchat chotei is plain. You leave out the shem levona because you don't want a chotei, you're a sinner, you're not supposed to be showing off, basically, we'll say. We'll discuss this in minachot. Says Gemara, it doesn't matter. Because it causes a kapara. Says Gemara, well, I have a very interesting question. Iboilu. What about a minchat sota or minchat nidava? A minchat sota. Now, minchat sota, if you think about it, it doesn't fit into either category. It's not a minchat nidava because it's not voluntary, right? A sota, remember the case of sota, which we learned, is a woman who's sworn by her husband. Has yichud with a man long enough to sleep with him. She denies that she slept with him. The husband says, we don't know. She's got to go to the Beit HaMikdash, bring a mincha. So that's not a nidava she has to do.
Wait, when does she bring the mincha?
When she goes up.
She survives or before?
No. It's part of the process. She goes up to the Beit HaMikdash and brings the mincha, and then they make her drink the whole thing.
After?
The same time. First, the mincha.
Okay.
So, but it's not a minchat chotei, right? Because remember, a minchat chotei is done when you did a sin for sure. The sota claims she didn't do a sin, right? She's doing a mincha to be mivarer avon, to clarify whether she sinned or not. So is that a sinner mincha or is it not? So that's a good question, right? That's the Gemara's question. Minchat sota, minchat nidava is mem kodemet. Do you say, well, minchat nidava kadmash kentun Hashem levona, right? Because the minchat, regular mincha, needs Hashem levona, so maybe that's more important. Odilma minchat sota kadmash ken ba levarer avon. Although it doesn't come for a definite sin, it does come to clarify whether she did a sin or not. So what would be the halacha? Really good question.
Yeah.
Right? Tashma. Well, the wait is over to answer the question. Because you look at our Mishnah, and our Mishnah says, minchat chotei kodemet minchat nidava. That a minchat chotei comes before minchat nidava. Now, the Mishnah does not say minchat sota. It says minchat chotei, implying minchat chotei dekadma minchat nidava, ha minchat sota lo. It says, well, no, you didn't read the Mishnah very well if that's where you stopped. Because the Mishnah continued and gave a reason. Why did the minchat chotei come before minchat nidava? Says the Mishnah, Mipnei, you could look in 2 lines ahead in the Gemara, but I'll read it from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said, 3 lines from the end of the Mishnah, 2 lines from then, Mipnei shehu ba al chet, because it comes for a sin. Says Gemara, does the Mika Tani of she michaperet? The Torah didn't say that you bring a minchat chotei in front of a minchat nidava because it causes forgiveness. Mipnei she ba al chet katani. It said it comes in relation to a sin. That's a very roundabout way of saying it. Why do we say it that roundabout way? To include even a minchat sotah. Because a minchat sotah comes because you're trying to clarify whether she did a sin. So zunami, hanami ba'achet. So therefore, our Mishnah seems to imply the opposite, that a minchat sotah will come before a minchat nidava, just like a minchat chotei. Tashma, let's come and prove it from another Braita, and this is very similar to a Braita we quoted yesterday. Says the Braita, it's a little hard to give a place, we are a little more than halfway down, right to the right of the Tosfot of Limikra'ah K'tima HaKatuv. So says the Gemara Tashma, and now we're quoting a Braita. The Braita says the following, Zu kodemet lezu. This comes before this. Now, of course, the problem with saying the word this is that we don't know what you're talking about, right? So this thing comes before this thing. Right? And the Braita doesn't tell us which thing comes before which thing, but it gives a reason, and by the reason, you'll be able to understand what we're talking about. Says the Braita, Shezu ba'a min hachitin, v'zu ba'a min hasaorim. Because this one comes from chitin, wheat, and this comes from barley. And as anybody knows, wheat is considered to be a higher a level grain than barley. Right? Barley is considered to be a poor man's grain, and wheat is considered to be a rich man's grain. Not sure why, but that's the way it was. Maybe it's tastier. So now, if you recall, almost every mincha comes from chitin. If you recall that the minchat sota comes from barley, right? So presumably that's what the mincha that the Braita is telling you. My love, minchat nidava is a minchat sota. That the minchat nidava, meaning the mincha brought as a gift, which is flour, wheat flour, comes before sota, which is barley flour. So that the Braita is clarifying what you do. This is where, well, not necessarily, because remember, every minchat chotei is brought from barley, because again, we don't want a minchat chotei to be fancy. So maybe the Braita is just saying a minchat chotei comes before, no, the opposite way. I take it back. Every mincha is done with wheat flour. The only mincha that's done sa'orim besides the minchat omer is the sota, right? So maybe what the Braita is saying is that a minchat chotei, a regular minchat chotei, comes before a minchat sota.
But not
a nidava. That's right. So maybe it's telling you minchat chotei which is wheat, comes before minchat sota. Says well, that's that's a nice thing to say, but why in the world would the bright to say because one is wheat and one is barley? Why don't you say because one is a kapara and one is not a kapara, right? Like the Mishnah said, typically right? Because the woman, not the woman, anyone who does a minchat chote gets a forgiveness. A sota doesn't get forgiveness. What happens if a sota did it wrong?
She dies.
She dies. She doesn't get forgiven from her mincha. So maybe that's, why don't you say that reason? Says the Gemara, okay. So you're going to have to understand, Elamai, minchat nidava. Well, then why don't you say a different reason? Why should a minchat nidava come before minchat sota? Because maybe a minchat nidava needs shemen and levona, right? Typically, the zutun hashem and levona, the zutun hashem and levona. Ella, you can have two reasons. Chan mitreta minaket. You can have two reasons why one thing would come before the other, and the Braita is giving you one of the reasons. So you basically can't prove from this Braita, which just says this one comes before this one because this is wheat and this is barley, that a minchat nidava of wheat comes before a minchat sota of barley, because maybe the Braita is telling you that a minchat chote of wheat comes before a minchat sota of barley, and that of course makes sense to us, but it doesn't prove one way or the other what happened with a minchat sota and a minchat nidava, and this question remains open. So when the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, we have to be very careful to avoid that situation. Okay? So just
has a note saying that Rambam posking you can do either in either order.
You can do one or the other, you're saying. Right. Tosfot actually said that yesterday about a different context. Remember, we learned that novel today. Anyways, that if the Torah is not, remember yesterday we had this discussion that our Mishnah in one case said a chatas comes before an ola, and it didn't tell you which chat, it didn't tell you about asham, right? So we said, well, maybe it's a chatat and not an asham, or maybe it's ola and not an asham. And Tosfos there says maybe you could just say either way, right? It doesn't matter. Sorry, not Tosfot. The Rabbi Kiva Eger said that. Remember the Gilyon HaShas that we learned yesterday. Okay. Anyways, continues the Gemara now. We are at the two dots around 15 lines from the bottom. Okay. The Mishnah said, a chatat ha'of, the chatat of a bird comes before an olah, the last words in the Mishnah, a chatat ha'of kodemet le'olah ha'of, v'chein behektesha. Right? So if you have a pair of birds, which was very common, you would do the chatas first, then the olah, and when you're making them kodesh, you would say this one is a chatat and this one is an olah first. Says the Gemara Minan Mili. How do you know this? The Tanur Rabbanan. We quote a Braita. The Braita says the following. It says, and this Braita is referring to a yoledet, I believe, right?
Bringing the birds?
It's not referring to a yoledet. It's referring to, I wish I had your Gemara Nafa, which has the psukim, but this was referring to a karban olev yored, right? So it says if a person is not wealthy and they can't bring an animal, they bring a pair of birds. And the pasuk then says, now I'm reading the pasuk in our Gemara, it's the end of Parashat Vayikra. V'hikriv et asher lechatat rishona. You bring the one that's the chatat first. Now, says the Braita, matam alomer. Why do you have to say that? She'ein tam alomer l'lamech tikrav rishona. It doesn't need to say it to tell you to bring it first. Because Harei Kvar Nemar, it already says that hasheni yaseh olah. Do the second one as an olah. If you do the second one as an olah, the first one obviously is a carbon chatat. So why did you tell me do the chatat first? Ela zeb bane'av. This is a general teaching to tell you kol chataot yikdemu la'olot habaot imahem. That whenever you have a carbon chatat and a carbon olah, the chatas goes first. Bein chatat ha'of lo'olat olof, whether they're both birds. Bein chatat behima lo'olat behima, or they're both animals. Let's say you show up in the Beit HaMikdash with an animal that's a chatat, an animal that's an olah, you bring the animal of a chatat first. And afilo, and this is really radical, so hold on to your seat, chatat ha'of lo'olat behima. Even a chatat of a bird goes before an animal, even though we said in the Mishnah that animals always go before birds. This is an exception to that rule. If you have a chatat that's a bird and an animal that's an olah, the bird goes first.
Crazy.
Crazy. See? Why? It says, well, let's read that inside. Hilkach. Now, therefore, here's the rule, right? It's amazing, Avi, isn't it? Amazing. Hilkach, chatat ha'of lo'olat ha'of. Now, how do you know that if you have a bird that's a chatat, that it comes before an olah, that's a bird, that's from the pasuk we just quoted. Et hasheni chatat. Et hasheni, sorry, right? That the second one is the olah, right? The pasuk we just quoted, 6 lines out. Et hasheni yaseh olah. How do you know that a chatat behima comes before an olaf beima. That was what we said yesterday. Rabbi Rachman, I remember we had the pasuk yesterday of par sheni ben bakar tikach chatat, right? That the second par is done for the chatat. Chatat ha'of. Sorry, not that pasuk. The next pasuk. It said asat echad chatat ve'echad ola. Right? How do you know this final halacha that even if one is a bird and one is an animal, the chatat comes first? Chatat of lolat beimam mizeh bana av. That's from the extra words in the pasuk, which is a binyan av. Right? So the pasuk says higriv et asher the chatat rishona. That's a principle. Chatas always comes before an ola. Okay. Now the Gemara is going to ask in a little bit, which you're probably wondering already. What if you got three animals? Right? What if you have a chatat, an ola, and say a shlamim, that's an animal, but the chatat and the ola are birds.
That's a nova.
What do you do there, right? So we're going to ask that question in a little bit before you rush ahead to ask it. But before we ask that question, says the Gemara, we have a problem. Tashma, we have a big problem from a statement of Rebbe Eliezer. Because Rebbe Eliezer raised a very complicated question. Now, I'm going to say some of this outside because I find it very complicated. And hopefully that'll help us learn it inside. If you recall, very often, not very often, but sometimes, the Torah says that if you are not rich enough to bring an animal, you bring birds. And in most circumstances, if you were rich, you would bring a karban chatat. For example, yeah, I'm going to put aside Nazir for a second. I'm going to use the Olev Yored examples, right? At the end of Parashat Vayikra, we have all the examples of Olev Yored. For example, if you swear falsely, right? Shvat Edut, or you swear Sheker, or Tuma, things like that, right? Not going into Beit HaMikdash, but eating Betuma. So in those cases, if you're rich, you bring a karban chatat, right? If you're poor, you bring birds. If you bring birds, you bring a chatat and an ola. But in those circumstances, the pair of birds, basically are replacing a karban chatat, right?
Even though they're being brought as.
Even though you're bringing a pair, one's a chatat and one's an ola, the parent karban is a chatat, right? So you could imagine in those cases, Rebbe Eliezer is going to say, the chatas comes first, because really the source of it all is a karban chatat. But there's an exception to that rule. And the exception to that rule was two exceptions actually. One exception is where basically you would bring two karbanot if you were rich and two karbanot if you're poor. So then they're basically each replacing themselves. Okay. But the other and the main exception is a yoledet. Because if you recall, when a woman gives birth, the Torah says that she should bring, and Rashi quotes this here, she should bring a animal, a ola. Where's the Rashi? Rashi says, Kigoni Yoledi Ashira. She brings a keves ben shnatola ola. So she brings a lamb for an ola and a bird for a chatat, right? Ben Yonah otor the chatat. If she's poor, then she brings two birds, one for an ola and one for a chatas. But the second bird that she's bringing now replaces her ola, it doesn't replace her chatas, right? So Rebbe Eliezer is about to tell you in a second that he thinks that in that case, the bird of the yoledet of ola should come before the karban chatas. Because since the bird is replacing an ola, right?
No.
So let's read that inside. Rebbe Eliezer Omer, Tashma, Rebbe Eliezer Omer, Kol makom shetchafa chatat, any place where the birds are replacing a karban chatat, like say a shvuat sheker, right? Then chatat kodemet. But kan bayoledet, when you take out the word or put in the word, bayoledet, ola should be kodemet. Because since the bird comes to replace the ola, it should come first. And furthermore, says Rebbe Eliezer, kol makom sheba achet, usually you bring a karban for chet, and like shvuat sheker, shvuat edut, chatat kodemet. But in ola by yoledet, the yoledet didn't do any sin. She gave birth to a child. That's not a sin, right? So by ola kodemet, because she didn't do a sin. So the ola should come first, right? If the two birds come in replace of one chatat, like I said, the first case is, then I get chatat kodemet. But kan by a yoledet, the ola should be kodemet. So basically, Rebbe Eliezer is arguing and saying, now it's not saying he's arguing, but that the pasuk seems to imply that a yoledet breaks the rules. Because by a yoledet, the pasuk says, now if you look at the pasuk by yoledet, which Nava has, where's the pasuk? It says if you bring two birds, where am I? Here, Bimalot imei tahara. It says you bring a karban. Sorry. This is Perik in Vayikra Yud Bet Chet, right? It says if she's not wealthy enough by a yoledet, then she should bring Shnei Torim L'Shnei B'nei Yonah, Echad le'olah ve'echad le'chatat. So this goes against our principle, right? Because usually we say a chatat comes before an olah, but by a yoledet, if she's poor, she brings echad la'olah ve'echad le'chatat, and Rebbe Eliezer is giving all the rationale for that because it's not done for sin, because it's replacing a carbon olah. So this seems to go against the principle of our Mishnah, which is that a chatat always comes before an olah. Says Rava, slow down. All Rebbe Eliezer is telling you is why the Torah says echad la'olah ve'echad le'chatat. That's why the Torah says the word olah first. But in practicality, when you show up at the Beit HaMikdash, you should do the chatat first. Lemikraot hakaktima hakatuv. It's only putting it first in the Torah for all the reasons that you just gave. But in practical action, it doesn't go first because of the principle of our Mishnah that a chatat always comes before an olah. Okay, so that is Rava's explanation. Tashma. Now says Gemara, let's try to keep questioning this from another Braita. The Braita says we're at the last line of Daf Tzadi Amud Aleph. It'll get easier from here. Parim kodmim le'elim. If you got a cow, that comes before an ayil. An ayil is a goat. I think we translated it. No, an ayil is a sheep, but it's an older sheep, right? An ayil is older than a keves. It's like a 2 years instead of a 1 year, right? Keves ben shnato, and ayil is 2 years. So a par comes before an ayil. An ayil comes kodmim lekfasim. An ayil is older. An ayil comes before a keves. Kfasim come before seirim, come before goats, which are also the same year, but goats don't have the fat pad on the back of the tail that you would bring, so they're basically less juicy for the mizbeach. Okay. Now the question is, what are we talking about? My love, the chag. Presumably we're talking about the chag. Remember on Sukkot, you bring all these carbonot, but if you recall in Sukkot, the keves, right, is done. The seirim is done the chatat, right, and the kfasim are done for olah. And we just said, or so the par is done for an olah, right?
That makes sense because it comes first.
No, the kfasim are done for an olah. Sorry, and so the kfasim come before the seirim, even though the kfasim are an olah and the seirim are a chatat. So it goes against our principle, right? Says Gemara, you're right. It's not referring to the chag. Dinidava. It's talking about where a person walked up and said, "I want to donate many animals. I have a whole flock of animals. Here's a par, here's a sayir, here's a keves. They're all olot. They all go together." So there, says the Gemara, first line, parim kodmim le'elim. The par goes first because remember a par. Because the par is bigger, you have to bring more nisachim. Remember, you bring 3 esronot, right? 3 portions of nisachim, shnei esronim, shlosha esronim, sorry, lepar, shnei esronim la'ayil, right? We all quote that many, many times in Musaf, right? So therefore, a par is first because it's nitrabeh nisachim. Echein elim lekfasim, because remember, an ayil also is shnei esronim, and a keves is isaron echad. And then kfasim l'seirim shkein nitrabu ba'alya. So it's not referring necessarily to sukkahs, it's referring to a nidava. Okay, Tashma, let's bring it from one last Braita, which may be familiar to all of you, from the end of Masechet Harayot. Okay? Says the Braita at the end of Masechet Harayot, Par kohen Mashiach kodem lepar helam davar shel tzibor. Let's say everyone does things wrong, right? And you've got a par, remember the par kohen Mashiach was a chatas, and you have a par helam davar shel tzibor, which is a chatas. The kohen Mashiach goes first. And we learned it from a pasuk in Masechet Harayot. Okay? That's not part of our question. Continues the Braita. If you have a par helam davar shel tzibor, that's called the par avodat kochavim. That comes before the par avodat kochavim. If you recall, if the community does avodat kochavim, they bring 2 carbonot, a sa'ir lechatat and a par for an olah. So obviously a par helam davar comes first because it's a chatas over a par of avodah zarah, which is a olah, right? So that fits. We're all happy. But the next lines are going to make you unhappy. Because continues the Braita, par avodat kochavim kodem l'sirei avodat kochavim. At the par of avodah zarah, which is an olah, comes before the sa'ir, which is a chatat. Now, why in the world? Now says the Gemara. This is now the Gemara speaking. Afagav the par avodah kochavim olah sa'ir avodah kochavim chatat. Right. So you see that there's a circumstance where you bring a carbon olah before a carbon chatat, which goes against our Mishnah. Says Gemara, well, that's a great thing to say, but what about the first part of the Braita? First part of the Braita said that if you have a par of a helam davar shel tzibor, you bring it before a par of a dazara. Why? Because the chatat comes before an olah. So the Braita is internally not consistent. First it says a chatas comes before an olah, then it says olah comes before a chatas. Right? Ema meresha. Well, why don't you look at the first part, which said par helam davar shel tzibor couldn't the par of a chavim because it's a chatas. Swear that's not a problem. Because obviously, bichad mina lo kam mina. Right? If it's the same species, if it's a par and a par, or a sa'ir and a sa'ir, you bring the chatas first. No one's problem with that. The question is, what if one animal is greater than the other? You have a par and a sa'ir. So on one hand, a par is better than a sa'ir. On the other hand, a chatat comes before an olah. How do you reconcile that? And the problem with this Braita is that the Braita says you reconcile it by bringing the par first, which goes against our Mishnah, which said that even if one is an animal and one is a bird, the chatat of the bird comes first. So, but the question here is, right? Bichad minan le'elkamin drachmana kadma, chatat kadma. Kikar minan, where I'm asking a question, betray mini. And what you see from this Braita is ashkechan ola de kadma the chatat. So this is a fatal Braita. Says the Gemara, well, not such a big problem because clearly there's an exception. Because if you read the Torah, when it says the word chatat, but when it says the word chatat by a sa'ir of avodah zarah, it's written different than every other time it says chatat in the Torah. Maybe not every, but almost every. Usually the word chatat is chet, tet, aleph, taf, with an aleph. This chatat is written without an aleph. And it's there to tell you, hopefully you guys can still hear us, since our internet's a little unstable, but I hope not, is that this,
stable.
Amri Rava Mishmei de Rava Bar Mari, chatat avodat kochavim chaser aleph. It says lich chatat ktiv, without an aleph. And therefore it's telling you, although every other chatat in the world comes before the ola, not this one. And Ravina says it's based on the pasuk kimishpat ktiv. It says the word kimishpat, meaning do it this way, which tells you don't change anything. You guys hear us? We're okay still? We're good. Okay. Kimishpat. And hashadati lachi, now that you brought this pasuk of kimishpat, afilu tema parim dechag nami. It could be that earlier Braita, which said a par comes before an ayol, a par comes before an ayol, which comes before a shlamim, comes before a kfasim, comes before siirim, is in fact referring to sukkahs, where the kfasim are shlamim, right? And the sa'ir izim is a chatat. Why would you bring a shlamim before a chatat? Maybe it's because it's an exception, because it says the word kimishpatam. Param dechagnami kimishpatam tifu, it says the word kimishpatam. And so maybe the Torah is saying sometimes there's exceptions to the rule. The rule is generally that you bring a chatat before an ola, but there's a few exceptions if the Torah specifies it. Okay. 2 dots halfway down. Ibaylu, one last question before we get to the next Mishnah. And the question is that we've all been wondering about, what if you have the following 3 animals show up at one time? A chatat of and olat behima, okay, which we said in the Mishnah, or in the Gemara at least, that the chatat of comes first. Even though it's a bird and an animal, with a chatat, it's a special binyan av, that a chatat comes first. But you have a third animal there at the same time, and that is maser, which is the lowest of all animals, right? We said in the order, not to lower it. It's the least of all the animals, the maser. But still, it's an animal, right? Eza mehem kodem. Which one comes first? Do you say tikdom chatata of, that first you should get the chatata of, but ika maaser dekadimla? You can't bring a chatata of before maaser, because maaser is an animal, and animals usually go before birds, right? So ika maaser dekadimla. So then you think you should bring the karban maaser. Sorry, Ken, I'll catch you up just because you just joined, but the question here is, the Mishnah gave many principles about what comes first. One of the principles was that all animals come before all birds when you get to karbanot. But a second principle that we've been discussing all day today is that whenever you have a chatat and an ola, the chatat comes first, even if it's a chatat of, a bird comes before an olat behima. And so the question now is, what if you have 3 animals, right? One is a chatat of, so it's a bird, but it's a chatat. One is an olat behima, which is an ola, usually goes second to a chatat, but it's an animal. And the third is maaser, which is an animal, right? Your 10th animal. So maaser usually would be last on the list. But in this case, it can't go after a chatat of because it's a bird,
Why
right?
can't it go after?
Because the principle of birds, of chatat and ola, is only about chatat and ola when you bring a pair of birds, remember? So maaser should come before, the maaser behima should come before chatat of. But the problem is that it can't come before an ola. Because remember that when you have maaser and ola, the ola comes first,
Okay.
right? So let's read that inside. So do you say that the chatat of comes first? That can't come first because there's maaser behima. So ika maaser dekadimla. Likta maaser. Do you say that the maaser behima should come first, but ika olat behima dekadimla? But the problem is that you can't bring maaser before ola because ola is burnt entirely on the mizbeach. Maaser is eaten at home, right? So you can't go that. So what are you going to do? Do the ola first. Tiktam ola behima. But remember, the principle is that an ola never comes before a chatat. Ika chatata of tekadmala. You got a chatata of, so you're really stuck. Says the Gemara, we don't know what to do. But hacha, here always means in Bavel, where they asked the question. Targima, they said, min zevach adif. You know what? You got to go with the animals first. The animal has to go first. You have to go with the zevach. That's the principle. And therefore, you should bring the the
Oh.
zevach first. Sorry, what does Rashi
Okay.
say? Meaning that you've got to bring the animal first,
So the Ola comes
and therefore you
first?
should. Rashi says you should bring the maaser first because that goes as a zevach. Now you're left with two animals, a chatat of and an olat behema. We know the chatat goes first before the ola, chatat before the ola. That's what they said in Bavel. B'marava Amri in Eretz Yisrael, they said, Ayla bat ba olat behema b'chatat of v'agbata mimaaser. Then in fact, you don't look at it that way. The olat behema goes up, meaning it becomes Ailam Rashi means it becomes more chashuv, it becomes more respectful. So that the ola of the behema basically is much more kodesh, right, than the maaser, because an ola is completely burnt and maaser is not. So basically, the maaser gets pushed down to the bottom. The ola goes ahead of the maaser. Now, when you push the maaser to the bottom, you've got an olat behema and a chatata of, and the chatata of goes first, and therefore the bird would go, then the ola, then the maaser. So the more important thing here would be how you look at each individual carbon and you push down the maaser to last. That's how they solved it. Now let's learn the Mishnah in the last few minutes we've got. The next Mishnah, almost 2/3 of the way down on Daf Tzadi Amud Bet, says the Mishnah, we talked a lot about Chatat and Ola, but going the next step, Kol HaChataot shebetorah kodemet l'ashamot. Every Karban Chatat comes before a Karban Asham, Chutz mi Asham Mitzora, except for the Asham of the Mitzora, Mipnei Shuba al HaKasher, which is not the Yersai, which probably seems, but LaHachshir, right, is what the Shita says. Because the Asham Mitzora comes to be Machshir and Mitzora, so basically functions like a Chatat in that regard. So it should come first. Tosa says because the blood is associated with it, so it's really an important part of the Mitzora. Okay? Continues the Mishnah, Kol HaShamot shebetorah ba'in b'nei shtayim. Usually an asham has to be a 2-year-old animal, right, in second year of life, which is what we call an ayil usually, right? Uba'in b'kesef shkalim, it has to be worth two shkalim, as we said, right, it has to be shnei shkalim. Chutz mi asham nazir v'asham mitzora. With the two exceptions being asham nazir and asham mitzora, where the Torah specifically says that you bring a animal that's bat shnana, that's 1 year. Keves bat shnato, Rashi quotes, right? So it's a first-year animal, and since it's a first-year animal, it does not have to be that valuable. So it's a first year. B'nei shehein ba'im b'nei shnatan. They're in their first year of life. Ve'im ba'im b'kesef shkalim. They don't have to be 2 shkalim worth of value. Okay? Now, says the Mishnah, these Mishnahs are a little disjointed. The same way we've been talking up till now about if you have 2 animals in front of you, which one you bring first, right? You bring a chatas before a shlam, an asham, and a shlamim, etc. Kishem shekodmim b'hakravatan, just like you have kedima when you bring it on the mizbeach, kain kach kodmin b'achilatan. The same thing would be true about eating it, right? Let's say 2 carbonot were in front of you. One is a chatas and one is a shlamim. The chatat should come first, right? Even though you can have both, you should eat the one that's more tadir or more kodesh. Sorry. However, what if you have, remember, shlamim can be eaten for 2 days. So what if you have a situation where on Monday morning you have 2 karban shlamims in front of you, one from Sunday and one from Monday?
Usually
Says the Mishnah, shlamim shel emesh. If you have a shlamim of yesterday and shlamim shel hayom, then do the one from yesterday first, because the one from yesterday is going to expire sooner than the one from today, right? So make sure it doesn't become notar. Shel emesh kodmim l'shel yom. Okay. Now, what if you have a shlamim shel emesh, a shlamim of Sunday, which you can eat till the end of the day Monday, and you have a chatat v'asham shel hayom. You have a chatat and asham of Monday, which you can only eat till Monday. So they're both stuck for that day. So Nava thinks, well, the chatat is more holy than shlamim, so you should eat that first. The Mishnah disagrees with you. Says the Mishnah, shlamim shel emesh kodmim divrei Rabbi Meir. And we'll see in the Gemara why, but presumably it's because it was shechted first. So it got kedusha first, and therefore you should do that one first. But the Chachamim agree with Nava. Chatat kodemet, that you should eat the karban chatas, pepnei shehi kadshei kadashim, because it's a higher level of kedusha. And furthermore, and this is a bright that we quoted earlier, it says here on Daf Ayin Vav Amud Bet, I remember we learned it at Daf Yomi, Kulan, all of these karbanot, hakohanim, rishayim, lishanot b'achilatan, the kohanim can customize how they eat it, right? They're allowed to cook it any way they want, except for the karban Pesach, of course, but they can cook it any way they want. Lechlan sluyin, they can roast it. Shlukim, they can boil it. Mivushalim, they can cook it. They can make a stew, a chalin, anything they want. Latei letochan tavlei, fulin, you could put inside of it any kind of spices and onion powder and oil and salt and tavlei truma. You can even put truma inside of it. Divrei Rebbe, assuming you're a Kohen, but that's who's eating most of these kachim, right? Divrei Rebbe Shimon. And if you recalled, this was the proof earlier. The Rabbi Shimon says you're allowed to be mevi kachim lebeit hapsul, right? Because if you put truma into your carbon, you have to eat the truma that day. If you that night, you're going to throw it away. Otherwise, you'd have your truma forever, right? And Rabbi Meir Omer, you should not do that. Lo yitain letochot havlei truma. You shouldn't put spices of truma into your carbon. Shelo yavia truma lidei psul, because you're going to bring your truma to psul. If you don't finish it, you'll have to throw away the truma, or otherwise you would not have to. And we discussed this a lot a few weeks ago. But we will stop here. That's the end of the Mishnah. And tomorrow morning, God willing, at 7:45 a.m., we will get into the next question of what happens when Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Bet contradict each other, right? So the first Mishnah was Tadir, before Tadir, Eno Tadir. The second Mishnah was Mikudash, before Eno Mikudash. What if you have Tadir on one side and Mikudash on the other side? That's the Gemara tomorrow. Okay, Shavua Tov, happy Almost Hanukkah. I'll see you tomorrow morning, I hope.
Yasher Clark, see you tomorrow.
Good night.